50 students were asked, to which cause should we donate the money we raised? This table shows the survey results. 3 students used a circle graph to represent these data. Here are their strategies. Chris took grid paper and made a strip of 50 squares. He colored the first 12 squares red to represent medical research. He colored the next 18 squares blue to represent famine relief. He colored the next 11 squares green to represent disaster aid. He colored the last 9 squares yellow to represent wildlife protection. Chris knew that 50 squares represented 100% of the whole, so 1 square represented 2% of the whole. So, to calculate the percent of the whole that each color represents, Chris multiplied the number of squares by 2. 12 times 2 is 24. So, medical research represents 24% of the whole. 18 times 2 is 36. So, famine relief represents 36% of the whole. 11 times 2 is 22. So, disaster aid represents 22% of the whole. 9 times 2 is 18. So, wildlife protection represents 18% of the whole. Chris joined the ends of the strip to form a circle. He traced around the inside of the circle and marked the ends of each colored segment along the circle. Chris marked a point at the center of the circle, or where he thought it might be. He couldn't tell for sure. He then joined the markings on the circle to the center point to create the sectors. He labeled each sector with its category and percent. Finally, he titled the graph, "To which cause should we donate?" Maya used a percent circle to create her circle graph. The circumference is divided into 100 congruent parts. So, to graph the data, Maya needed to find the percent of the whole that each cause represented. To find each percent, she wrote an equivalent fraction with denominator 100. 12 out of 50 students chose medical research. 50 times 2 is 100, so she multiplied 12 by 2 to get 24. 24% of students chose medical research. Maya counted 24 tick marks along the circumference of the circle and colored the related sector, labeling it medical research, 24%. 18 out of 50 students chose famine relief. 50 times 2 is 100. So she multiplied 18 by 2 to get 36. 36% of students chose famine relief. From the first sector, Maya counted 36 tick marks along the circumference of the circle and colored the related sector, labeling it famine relief, 36%. 11 out of 50 students chose disaster aid. 50 times 2 is 100. So she multiplied 11 by 2 to get 22. 22% of students chose disaster aid. From the second sector, Maya counted 22 tick marks along the circumference of the circle and colored the related sector, labeling it disaster aid, 22%. 9 out of 50 students chose wildlife protection. 50 times 2 is 100. So she multiplied 9 by 2 to get 18. 18% of students chose wildlife protection. Maya checked the remaining sector had 18 tick marks along the circumference of the circle. It did! So she colored the sector and labeled it Wildlife Protection, 18%. To complete the graph, she titled it, "To which cause should we donate?" Brayden used a compass and protractor to create his circle graph. Like Maya, he first calculated the percent of the whole that each category represented. Then he used a compass to draw a circle. He remembered that a circle has a central angle of 360 degrees. So, the sector for medical research should have a sector angle of 24% of 360 degrees. The sector for famine relief should have a sector angle of 36% of 360 degrees. The sector for disaster aid should have a sector angle of 22% of 360 degrees. And the sector for wildlife protection should have a sector angle of 18% of 360 degrees. 24% of 360 degrees is about 86 degrees. Brayden drew a radius of the circle. Then he used his protractor to mark an angle of 86 degrees at the center of the circle. He drew a radius that passed through the mark. He labeled the sector Medical Research 24%. 36% of 360 degrees is about 130 degrees. Then Brayden marked an angle of 130 degrees and drew a radius through the mark. He labeled the sector Famine Relief 36%. 22% of 360 degrees is about 79 degrees. Then Brayden marked an angle of 79 degrees and drew a radius through the mark. He labeled the sector Disaster Aid 22%. 18% of 360 degrees is about 65 degrees. Finally, Brayden used his protractor to check that the final sector angle measured 65 degrees. Then he labeled the sector Wildlife Protection 18%. To complete his graph, he titled it, "To which cause should we donate?" Which strategy resulted in the least accurate graph? Which strategy would you use?